The Japanese government, in an effort to cut off Chinese supplies, decided to invade French Indochina 3 years after the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. It was an easy target as Germany had just finished their 46-day conquest of the French mainland. In a bold move, Japan now aligned itself with Germany and Italy by signing the Tripartite Pact, in the hopes that the US would be too intimidated into loosening its hostile stance towards Japan. The following year, Japan began showing interest in the Dutch East Indies. In response to Japanese aggression, the US announced an oil embargo and froze Japanese assets being held in the US. With their fuel supplies dwindling, the Imperial Japanese Navy knew that they had to act fast. In July 1941, they predicted they would run out of fuel in just 2 years due to the US embargo. To sustain themselves in a prolonged conflict, Japan had no choice but to launch a series of aggressive attacks on Malaya and Dutch East Indies for their oil, rubber, tin and iron. But there was one problem: the Philippines, controlled by the United States. If Japan's invasion of British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies prompted the US to enter the war, the Philippines could not only serve as a crucial staging area for an invasion of Japan, but they could also block off any imports to Japanese mainland. To achieve Pacific supremacy, the Japanese knew that they would have to plan for US involvement and occupy these territories to form a fortified defence perimeter to ward off any potential threats. Japan's strategy in the Pacific War was to limit the conflict by raising the costs beyond what the Western powers, especially the United States, were willing to pay. This was not based on American military strength, but on their rationality. The US's own plan, called Plan Dog, was to prioritise defeating Germany first, conceding the loss of territories such as the Philippines, Guam and Wake Island. After Europe was under Allied control, the US planned to retake their Pacific holdings and strike Japan itself. However, this was all to change very soon. On the morning of December the 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, masterminded by the infamous Admiral Sir Oku Yamamoto. The elaborate plan involved coordinated efforts from aircraft and submarines to destroy key American air and naval targets. Despite the logistical challenges, the Japanese succeeded in their mission, destroying over 160 American aircraft, sinking 8 ships, including 4 battleships, damaging 10 more and killing 2,335 American sailors. The impact of the raid, described by historians as one of the most elaborate efforts to coordinate simultaneous attacks, was significant and marked a turning point in the Pacific theatre during World War II. Eyewitnesses who was on board the USS Arizona during the attack described a devastating scene as hundreds of Japanese planes filled the sky, raining bombs and torpedoes on the American fleet. Despite the heavy loss of life and the destruction of ships and aircraft, the attack did not achieve its intended goal of neutralising the US Navy's material advantage. In fact, the attack had a rallying effect on the American people and brought the United States into the war. However, the attack did provide a window of opportunity for Japan to occupy territories in Southeast Asia without much resistance. Also, it's important to note that prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had already approved the creation of the Manhattan Project. The purpose of this project was to explore the military potential of nuclear fission, a discovery that would ultimately change the course of world history, showing that maybe the US was already preparing for the war. As Japan gained control of Malaya, Singapore and the Dutch East Indies, their success was swift and devastating, almost like the Nazi Blitzkrieg. Singapore only fell in just 2 months, marking one of the worst defeats in British military history, a moment that is marked as the death of the British Empire. The Dutch East Indies, with their only advantage being numerical strength, were quickly captured by the Japanese and provided crucial access to oil fields in South Sumatra. In the Philippines, the situation was no better for the Allies. Hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, half of the US Army bombers at Clark Field were destroyed, making it clear that the Philippines would be an easy target for Japan's military advancement. As the Japanese Air Force swooped in with precision, the American air fleet was caught off guard, with many planes refueling on the ground. The attack resulted in the swift occupation of Manila, the capital of the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the local forces, was left with no choice but to order a retreat. The situation was dire, as historians wrote, with the besieged army facing shortages of food, medicine and modern weaponry. Despite this, the determined soldiers of Bataan, known as the Battling Bastards, held out against the Japanese onslaught. Their commander, General MacArthur, emerged as a national hero in the face of defeat. The Philippines fell to the Japanese, and American and Filipino forces were defeated, leading to the largest surrender in American history. The horrors of the Bataan Death March and the brutal treatment of prisoners of war left a lasting impact on survivors. General MacArthur, who had escaped to Australia, made a vow to return to the Philippines and seek revenge for the loss. In Burma, Japan fought to hold on to its stronghold, believing that doing this would disrupt the flow of aid to China and ultimately weaken the Chinese war effort. The campaign in Burma lasted from December 1941 to July 1945. In the spring of 1942, Japan aimed to cement its grip on the South Pacific by capturing the crucial port of Moresby on New Guinea. This move brought the Japanese fleet into contact with the Allied fleet, dispatched to stop them, leading to the Battle of the Coral Sea. Although the Japanese sank more ships, they were ultimately stopped in their tracks, and 2 of their aircraft carriers were left unusable for future combat. Historians see the battle as a tactical win for Japan, but a strategic victory for the Allies, as it halted Japan's advance and set the stage for the pivotal Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, was a decisive victory for the United States over Japan. It marked the turning point in the Pacific theatre of World War II, as the United States was able to repel the Japanese attempt to invade Midway Island and also sink 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers. The Japanese had planned to use Midway as a base from which to launch an invasion of Hawaii, but the United States, having cracked Japanese codes, was able to anticipate the attack and prepare accordingly. The battle saw the first use of radar by the US, which helped them locate the Japanese fleet. It was also the first time that carrier-based aircraft played a decisive role in a naval battle. Midway was a major blow to Japan's naval power, as they lost many of their experienced pilots and several of their most advanced carriers. It also marked the first time that Japan had lost a major battle, and it was a significant morale boost for the United States. In the aftermath of Japan's defeat at the Battle of Midway, the stage was set for the Guadalcanal campaign, marking the beginning of the Allied offensive in the Pacific. The campaign was met with fierce resistance from the Japanese, as well as the challenges of tropical diseases. However, by February 1943, American forces emerged victorious. At the same time, the US Army Air Force began to modify B-29 bombers for use in early atomic bomb attacks. The American strategy, known as island hopping, involved amphibious attacks on strategic islands which would serve as staging areas for a future invasion of Japan. As the Battle of Saipan raged on in June 1944, the Japanese found themselves trapped and facing certain defeat. But rather than surrender, many chose to take their own lives or charge into battle in desperate banzai attacks. The Japanese commander reportedly stated that there were no longer any differences between civilians and soldiers, and it would be better for them to fight with bamboo spears than be captured. The largest banzai charge of the war occurred in Saipan, with 4,300 Japanese charging in a 15-hour attack resulted in the destruction of the garrison and 650 American casualties. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, General MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return and liberate the islands. Following the decisive Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, as he came ashore he declared, "I have returned, by the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." In the Philippines, the Japanese mounted a fierce counter-offensive against the American Filipino forces, led by MacArthur. Despite their efforts, they sustained heavy casualties, with estimates reaching as high as 190,000. The American Filipino forces ultimately emerged victorious, pushing back the Japanese and reclaiming control of the islands. The second to last major battle of the Pacific theatre was the Battle of Iwo Jima, which took place in February 1945. Much like Saipan, it was a grueling and bloody month-long conflict. However, the American forces suffered even greater casualties on Iwo Jima, losing more men than the Japanese did, who lost their entire 17,000-man garrison. The battle reached its climax with the raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi, a location that had previously been used to bombard American forces. The Philippines campaign was a turning point in the war. This was as the Philippines was key for the Japanese. It was the base for their expansion in the Pacific and the base for the air raids on the mainland of America. The final major battle of the Pacific War was the Battle of Okinawa. It was a brutal and bloody affair. With the island's proximity to the Japanese homelands, both sides knew that the stakes were high. The Americans aimed to establish air bases from which to launch devastating air raids on the mainland, while the Japanese fought to protect it. The battle lasted for 3 grueling months and resulted in staggering casualties on both sides. The United States suffered 50,000 casualties with 20,000 deaths, while the Japanese lost a staggering 100,000 of their 110,000 garrison. The battle also had a devastating impact on the civilian population of the island, as they were caught in the crossfire of the fierce fighting. As the war raged on, Japan found themselves in a dire situation. Their once formidable navy lay in ruins, and their skilled pilots had been shot down. Their fortified islands were now in the hands of their enemy. American submarines controlled their home waters. Communication with the rest of the empire was all but cut off, and their cities were being relentlessly bombed. The civilians were on the brink of starvation, and to make matters worse, in March 1945, the first firebomb attack on Tokyo took place. Allied air bombing had killed an estimated 333,000 Japanese and injured 473,000, showing the scale at which the Allies were going to go. To make matters even worse, the atomic bomb was in its final stages of development, and it was given the green light for use in late July, leading to one of the most debated decisions in history. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and when Japan still refused to surrender, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki with equally as devastating effects. To make matters worse, on the same day as the Nagasaki bombings, the Russians invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, leading to the threat of a Soviet mainland invasion. On August the 14th, Japan unconditionally surrendered under the orders of Emperor Hirohito, and that was the end of the Pacific War and World War II for America, leading to a new age of global politics and the Cold War.